Wow. Hi. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining from different places. Where are you, all of you? So if you can actually use the chat box and just type it in where you're joining from, that would be great. I'm in Toronto right now. It's rainy. So where are you joining from? London, UK, I see. Oh, look at that. Singapore, 10 p.m. Wow. That's so neat. Well, welcome everyone. There's Belgium. Hello, hello. Malaysia, 10 p.m. Is that right? So, well, welcome. Well, so today's Israel. Oh, wow. Texas. Welcome, everyone. So thank you for having your videos, pictures on, and it really helps me to actually interact with you when we have this dialogue as well. So today's topic is the hidden patterns of better conversations. And I'm sure you have a very good reason to join today. So I would love to also ask you, when you hear this topic, the hidden patterns of better conversation, what were you thinking that it might be about? What are you hoping that it might be about? And what questions do you have about this particular topic? So please use the chat box. I'll be actually watching the chat box for your questions and feedback and so on. So please, when you heard this topic and you decided to sign up, what were you thinking or what were you hoping that this session might do for you? Feel free to type in the chat, because sometimes when you hear topics like the hidden patterns or better conversations, people have some ideas about what that might look like, sound like. And I would love to actually hear from you how you might define better conversations that are better. What's different about those? So think about maybe even it's people who just seem to know how to have like really good conversations with you. Like think about that conversation you had with somebody that just went really well. And also think about those conversations that didn't really go well, or you wish that you went differently. So think about what was different about those conversations. Sometimes it's even with the same person. And some days you have better conversations with them. Some days maybe you don't. So what is it that makes some conversations actually better and some other conversations, could be a little bit better, right? Oh, wow, look at this comments. My goodness, there you go. Thank you. And when we say patterns, I hope that some of you are researchers here. If you are, then a lot of researchers love this word, patterns. So there is something that we see as a pattern in some conversations that seems to work better than some other conversations. And I will be talking about my research, but hopefully in a way that is very fun rather than like research. What do you call it? The something square data. I'm not going to give you stats as much. So I'm going to give you some stories instead. Okay. So hopefully you are excited about this as much as I am. Would you be okay if I actually use some PowerPoints? Just because I made them and I think it looks fancy, I would like to actually show you the PowerPoints. Hopefully that's okay. I mean, look at this. So I'm proud of it. So it's a hidden patterns. When two people sit down, or maybe even team members, families, when they sit down to have a conversation. And this is an interesting word, conversation, by the way. Like traditionally, when I say traditionally, like we go all the way back to like 13th, 14th century, when the word first kind of appears. And back then, this word conversation actually didn't mean what we actually mean today. Conversation back then actually meant your address, where you live. So conversation actually was, if you were to deliver a, I doubt that they had Amazon back then, but let's say they actually had something they wanted delivered to their house. People will actually ask you, what's your conversation? In a way that it's your dwelling place. Where do you live? And I guess figuratively, this is still true, isn't it? Because all of us, we live in many conversations we've had. We wish that we had, that we know that we will be having, or we should be having. So when you think about this word conversation, the place you live, we do live in those conversations. And there are some patterns that we see, especially when you study conversations that are specialized or professional conversations like mentoring, coaching, supervision. There are some things that we do, like we do as a listener, we do as a speaker, we do together as in our interaction. And some conversations, people actually leave that conversation thinking that was really, really useful. Some other conversation, they're like, that was fun, but yeah. And some other conversation, you're really thinking, you really need to go and take a class on conversations. So what is it that we see? And by the way, this is a little bit about me. My dog is Kito, and I'm homeschooling two boys, 14 and 12 years old, and I care about changing conversations. But you know, one thing that I really care about is how do we really change those conversations around us, especially at your home, with your friends that you care about. And if you actually have a workplace that you work with other people, how do we change that conversation, right? So now here is, I'm going to actually show you a couple narratives so you can play with it. Now, here's a client number one, or client. What I mean by client is could be your coachee, mentee, or supervisee. This is what they say. So as I read this to you, I want you to really think about how you might want to respond to this person. Okay, so script number one. This person says, well, what's getting in the way is that, the system keeps changing. It's not even the system, it's probably the people behind the system. There's so little trust now that people are getting tired of even speaking up. So if you can help me figure out something, that's what they say. Right at this moment, as you're sitting down with this person in conversation, how would you like to actually respond to them? You don't have to type in the chat box, but it would be fun if you do. Let's say you're actually working with them like they're your coachee, or pick a role. It's your mentee. Maybe this is your child speaking to you. I don't know. So in your current role, how would you respond to this person? Okay, and feel free to use the chat box if you feel brave enough, and just, put it there. And I see that some of you say, what do you mean by that? Brian says, tell me more. Hey, same with Carrie, tell me more. Really? Tell me more. Oh, the tell me more. Oh, that's awesome. Look at that. And I see that Heather, that's another way of saying probably tell me more. Go on. Okay. Interesting, right? Or what happened, Nicola says. Christiane says, what do you want instead? Oh, that seems to be a lot going on. Are you connected to the system? Can you please give me some examples of what you mean? Happy to help. Look at that, eh? Wow. So these are some examples of responses that you will have. And what's interesting is Nancy says, what's suppressing trust? Because you see, so what we see here is some of you are actually responding, very interesting. Some of you are actually responding to the system, the actual words that the client is saying. I'm going to actually call them a client just for the ease of it. And then also, I see Sim Chu. You say, what would you want to figure out? Well, that's exactly what the client says. They want to figure out, right? And then also some other of you actually are speaking up. You just, Cecilia, you just chose this one. Some other people actually said, well, what's getting in the way? And some of you actually said trust. What is suppressing the trust? So many of you are actually picking up from what they say and ask about it, which is so interesting. Now here's maybe a second example I'm going to show you. This is pretty cool, eh? And we are kind of like seeing how people might actually, respond to these things. This is pretty neat when you do that. Now, here's a second example. This client actually says, well, I've been through a lot, but I'm here, aren't I? We've also gone through some tough times together, but hey, they didn't quit. I know we can be back in the game. Just need something fresh, like ideas or some inspiration. Okay, client number two. This is what they said. How would you respond to this client when the client says, hey, I've been through a lot, but I'm here, aren't I? We've also gone through some tough times together, but hey, they didn't quit. I know we can be back in the game, just need something fresh, like ideas or some inspiration. Okay. So, how would you respond to this client? It sounds like you have a lot going on. Where do you start? Okay, cool. Tell me about the game. Neat. And how will you know when you have something fresh or inspiring? This is a good group. What's happening here? Okay. I'm hearing in your words, voice, some determination. Is that right? Irene, okay. What does being back in the game look like, Peter or Petra? Imagine you are fresh and inspired. What would it look like? This is so interesting. So as you can see, some of you are picking up on some tough times, but also in the game, like tell me about the game. Something fresh, ideas, inspirations. You're picking up on some of those things. And Sherry says you're here and you made it together. What does fresh look like? I don't know where some of you are trained, but how do you do this? This is so amazing. Okay. And Nagesh, I hope I am actually saying your name right. And please correct me if I'm not saying it right, okay? Because there's something about saying the name properly. Is it okay? Oh, thank you. Thank you for your thumbs up. By the way, my name is pronounced hey sun, like saying hey to sun. The last name is Moon, and usually that's what confuses people. So somehow people, they call me Haesun. I don't know why they do that. Or sometimes they call me Hussein. I don't know why people do that. It's a hey sun. Hey sun, get it? Hey sun, Moon. Anyway, so if I pronounce your name wrong, please let me know, okay? And there are some other things like Carrie says, it sounds like you are very resilient. Tell me how you have gotten back in the game before, okay? So we have very interesting directions here because when Carrie says it sounds like you're very resilient, the word resilient doesn't show up in the client narrative, but this is kind of like summary or my opinion of my client. So it sounds like you're very resilient. So you're introducing new words that didn't come from the client. And very likely you see the ... that actually Carrie put right after that sentence. Guess what happens during those ... It sounds like you're very resilient. What do you think happens in that space? What do you imagine actually this client doing during that ... And people might reflect, they might think. You know what's interesting is it shows when you're sitting down with somebody and say, well, it sounds like you're very resilient, very likely they will make a gesture. Okay, they might do something, they might not, they might like tilt their head, okay, and they might do something to tell you that they're listening or they're agreeing, which is very interesting phenomenon actually in communications. So when you say something that the client didn't say themselves, and when you introduce, well, you sound like you're really resilient, and the client says, I guess so, great, move on. But if they say, I wouldn't call myself resilient, it's a cue to drop it, especially when you introduce new words. So there's so much happening in that ... right? So many times what we as practitioners do is we kind of, make interpretation of what we think we heard. And in communication research, what seems to happen actually as a pattern, this is the pattern I was going to introduce later, but it shows up, so I'll tell you. Usually when clients don't agree to what we actually propose is when we seem to introduce new words, new ideas, new concept. And that's when we see our clients be like, yeah, I guess so. Oh, yeah, but it's a very interesting pattern. When practitioners introduce new ideas from our perspective, we are taking a chance. But many times also as a pattern, our clients are polite enough to say, I'll go with it, and they'll go with it. Oh, there are so many patterns. I think you're going to love this. So interesting, isn't it? Client number one, client number two. And I know that you would love to work with both, but if you were to choose one client to work with, who would you like to work with? Client number one or client number two? So here, their narratives again. So who would you like to work with if given a chance that, they're going to actually have 3 to 6 sessions? Who would you like to work with? Okay, some of you are like 1, 2, 2, 2, 2, and they're okay, interesting. And you might have a very good reason to work with them. It's almost like an equal, isn't it? Oh, this is so interesting. And you must have a reason to pick that client. And what's interesting is both actually clear, right? Yeah, I see that. Oh, and somebody says, yes, good for you. Now, what was so interesting about this? Elena says one is much more challenging. Oh, one would be a challenge as it could turn into trash talk. Sherry, is that right? It's so interesting. What's wrong with this client, right? Sometimes when you see a narrative like this, client number one is often labeled as negative. Or sometimes in workplaces, if people say stuff like this, sometimes they're also called disgruntled, toxic, and blah, blah. Number two, they might actually have a little bit better label than number one. Would you agree? It's so interesting to see that. And David, number one, wants you to, do the work for them. Number two seems to be willing to work on their issues. Interesting. Yvonne says, you will meet new client number two on Friday. It was the same client, same person. And the narrative right before what they said was this, because we do this experiment. So when clients come in, we ask them, what is your topic? And they actually give us the initial topic. And for the research purposes or practice purposes, we ask our clients to start from the same place. So they started from pretty much this place. Depending on which coach they had, they either went to 1 or went to 2. So that was interesting. Same person, sometimes within like an hour. So it's not like they grew up to be more positive. No, they actually came in the very same day, just 2 different coaches. And Ryan, thank you for that emoji. That's so cute. So it's the same person, isn't it? So the same person, how could they even carry these different labels? This client started with this statement. They came in and the coach said, so what would be useful? How would you know this was useful for you as you sort of, go back to your life after our meeting together? And the client says, well, I need to figure out how I can support them get back on track. I've been struggling with it myself too, but I know that they look to me for support. I know this is not the first time and it won't be the last time either. Isn't that interesting? So this is what the client says. But then what happened to the client narrative for them to go to like number 1, number 2? And it seems it's not even a different day. It's actually the same day, same setting, within an hour. First coach, what they did was they, in their response, they asked, so you struggle with it too? What's getting in the, way of you achieving what you want? How can I help you? And the client says, well, what's getting in the way is that the system keeps changing. It's not even the system, it's probably the people behind the system. There's so little trust now that people are, where is it? Oh, I just went back, or did it actually go back? Or I'm not sure what happened, but there you go. And then people are getting tired of even speaking up. So if you can help me figure out something, that's what happened here. Now, a second coach did something a little bit different. Second person went, so it sounds like you want to support yourself and others through this. What gives you confidence that you can? And of course, this person says, well, I've been through a lot, but I'm here, aren't I? We've also gone through some tough times together, but hey, they didn't quit. I know we can be back in the game, just need something fresh, like ideas or some inspiration. This conversation happened in the first 3 minutes. So from starting from the initial narrative and The first response of the coach in this case was either 1 or 2, and this is what actually happened. So in your response, if you actually had, I mean, some of you actually put it in the chat box, but some of you who has written them down, have a look and kind of like, what kind of response are you eliciting? Because pattern number 2 or 3, I forget what number we're at, clients usually follow our lead. So if you are asking for something, because every question has assumptions embedded in it. Actually, let me go back and not go back, but let's look at what this client number 1 does. So the coach number 1 says, so you struggle in their response. So you struggle with it too. What's getting in the way of you achieving what you want? How can I help you? Now, in that response, what is this coach assuming? What are some assumptions that you see in this particular question, by the way? Coach says, what's getting in the way? Oh, the word in is missing. It's a hidden pattern. So what's getting in the way of you achieving what you want? How can I help you? Hey, what do you see as assumptions hidden in there? Assumption that something's getting in the way. Isn't that true? That some client needs help, client is struggling, and you struggling, well, client actually says, I've been struggling with it too. So struggle comes from the client saying it, but somehow assuming that things are getting in the way. Actually assuming that talking about will be useful. Isn't that interesting? And assumes that the coach has the answers because like, okay, how can I help you? And it's not a surprise that they actually answer that assumption. When clients answer us, they're actually answering our assumptions hidden in our questions. So they answer it. What's getting in the way is that the system keeps changing. And then they continue on and say, so if you can help me figure out something, this is the exact response to your assumption that you can help them figure out something. So they're answering your assumption. Here's a risk. If you say, what's getting in the way of achieving what you want? How can I help you? There's a very slight chance of them saying, well, nothing is really getting in the way, but that rarely happens because usually clients don't question our assumptions in our questions. Isn't that interesting? It's a leading question, Nicola. Every question we ask might be leading to something somewhere. But our job is to actually load those questions with a little bit better assumptions, probably. Now, second coach in their response says, so it sounds like you want to support yourself and others through this. Okay, this is a bit of a summary. And the word support actually comes from the client. And the question is, what gives you confidence that you can? Now, what is hidden in this question? What gives you confidence that you can? And, as somebody said here before, there is the ... It sounds like you want to support yourself and others through this ... During that time, the client nods, or they might even say, yeah, I do. And then you build on it by a question saying, what gives you confidence that you can? See, what are the assumptions in there, right? That they're capable, yeah. Use of confidence. That isn't that interesting. It's loaded and empowering, isn't it? And somehow just assuming that, and actually, is that Jeanette says it could be interpreted that the coach has a doubt over their confidence. I love it. So Jeanette, if you actually ask like this, so if you say, what gives you confidence? What gives you confidence? Like with skeptical face, absolutely. They'll be like, yeah, I don't know why I was so confident about it. Actually, now that you ask me like that. But really, it's in how you ask as well. Not only when you see it written, you can read it in any way. I mean, if I actually imagine my brother actually reading this to me, oh, it will be so sarcastic. He's a sarcastic guy. So if I imagine my brother coaching me, he's like, what gives you confidence that you can? And I'll be like, I guess I can't. But as a coach, you will actually pose it in a way that, well, it sounds like you want to support yourself and others through this. And the client says, I really do. And then you simply say, so what gives you confidence that you actually can? Now, then the assumption is a little bit more towards actual, I trust in you, I believe in your capacity, right? Oh, that's funny. So these are some of the differences in assumptions that we actually embed in our questions. That's how questions work. And when you look at, let's say, McGee or Janet Bavelas and all these people who are doing sociolinguistics or a microanalysis of face-to-face dialogue, they will show you even how are you doing today is full of assumptions. And actually, how are you may not be the best way to start your session. How are you? Okay, what are you going to get from that? Because usually when people, I remember this ESL class because I came here when I was 17, I didn't speak a word of English. And we went to this class and this teacher actually, the first thing that they taught us was greeting sequence. And what they said was, when somebody says, how are you? You don't tell them how you are really doing. Maybe it's a Canadian thing, I don't know. But they said, if somebody says, how are you? You don't say, oh, not too good. And don't burden them with your problems. That's what my ESL teacher taught me. So if somebody says, how are you? You say, I'm fine, thank you, and you. And that's the proper thing to do. And then the other person, of course, will be like, I'm fine, thank you. But really, some days you don't have good days. I mean, right now I am, grieving. There's a death in my family. My father passed about a little bit over a year ago, and still grieving. Some days better, some days not, too good. And when somebody says, how are you? I'm supposed to say, I'm good. You? Or do I have permission to say, I'm? So here's what I actually do to break the pattern of greeting sequence. When people actually ask me, how are you doing? I usually just say, I'm okay. And you know what people say when I say I'm okay? So if somebody says I'm okay to how are you, what comes to your mind? Here is the response I get all the time. So if I say I'm okay, many people say just okay. Hey, right? Just okay. Only okay? Are you really okay? Oh, I love it. And really, why is okay not good enough? Huh? So really, many times when people say, how are you? I'm like, I'm okay. And they're like, just okay. Yeah, it's not good. So I find it so interesting to disrupt some of those patterns that we're so used to. And then people all of a sudden, they're like, oh, I guess okay is good enough. Hey, Nagesh, I actually see your hand up. That's so sweet. Yes, questions.
Thank you. Yes, and that's really enjoying and learning a lot from the complexity of our conversations. The one thing I'm wondering is in your work, when you have clients, like you said, you and your brother, the cultural kind of values we bring. I mean, we're coaching folks across different cultural values, assumptions, and we may speak English, but what comes behind it could be very different. You have any thoughts around that? Because of course the assumptions are our assumptions and our lens in terms of what we are looking at.
Thank you for the question. I think what often happens is the complexity, as you say. Some words actually come with their history when we use them. So what are some examples like that in English, I guess? Okay, here's an example. So in English, when you say apologize, it's apologize. It's not a big deal. It's just a simple sorry, isn't it? But when I actually translate it to, like, when I understand this word apology in Korean, it sounds a lot more submissive and more substantial for some reason. So what happens is, when I hear apology, when somebody comes to me and they say they need to apologize, I take it so seriously. It's like such an intense moment for me. Somebody's apologizing, but then they're like, oh, I'm sorry, I actually forgot to pick up coffee or something. It's not something that needs apology. because some words actually bring its own history with it. That's kind of like we all have our local history with a word, and sometimes we have this collective history of a word. So for example, there are some thick history right now that is very loaded and important in Canada that's happening, residential schools. Now that word became very much like heightened, like everyone is very heightened with their awareness, sensitive topic, but it's a very important topic. So now what was interesting is I was talking to my nephews about something about residential. It's in completely different context about, oh, it's residential and this and that, that's my dog barking. And my nephew who's 12 turned to me and said, is that kind of like residential school? Now I'm like, no, it's not at all like that. It's no, totally different context. But what we do is, because he's so aware of this residential schools as it's actual, what he's actually learning in schools, the word itself actually is triggering for him. And there are many words like that right now. So that's one complexity, that words come with their own history, but also how we make meaning out of words, how we use it. It's another complexity on it. So for example, here's a word that I cannot pronounce properly still because it's a difficult pronunciation. So I usually tell kids when I need to cut something, I tell them, can you bring me the thing that cuts? You know what it is? Can you actually type in the chat box? You know what this is? I cannot pronounce it properly. So it sounds like Caesar salad when I actually pronounce it. So I actually first told them, can you bring me the Caesar? And they're like, what? It's like, thing that cuts. They're like, oh, and they actually corrected my pronunciation. So after that, that thing that cuts, I don't call it by its name, but it's an ongoing joke that I always say, can you bring me the thing that cuts? And they will, oh, you mean this? And they will actually correct me each and every time. Now that's how we're making meaning out of how we use it. And all these inside jokes that you somehow have, or shorthand with your friends, they kind of know what you mean by something without you having to say it. Or sometimes those people, when they call or when you call, at first, hello, they know what's happening. Like my mom, if I say hello, it's the same hello to me. Like I will say hello, and I sometimes pretend to sound very, charming, chirpy hello. She knows right away. She's like, what's wrong? So people who really get you at your first hello, there is something that they know in the way that is shared between the two of you. Shorthand, for example, inside jokes. Those are all the signs or codes that you share with a shared meaning. So it could be cultural, but these days, a lot of cultures are kind of like, what do you call it? They're merging. So, when you go to Korea, for example, I mean, I haven't been there for so long, but when you go to Korea, they don't actually walk around in traditional Korean clothes. They walk around like this. So culture and all these things are a little more merging these days, but you can actually still see some differences, but it's kind of hard to tell. So, but what happens is contextually, you will see what actually happens. And Nicola says it's like names. If my mom calls me Nicola, I know something's up. And especially for those of you with like middle names. And if somebody, your family member, addresses you with a full name, you're like, oh, what's going on? It's kind of like that. Anyway, when you actually think about your conversations with people who are very close to you, there are many patterns that you might start to notice because you get used to those patterns. So my sister, for example, when she wants to do something, she wouldn't actually make an explicit request, but she will kind of, yesterday, for example, she brought home, she lives in an apartment nearby and she doesn't have a washer at home, like a laundry machine at home. So she brought to my house a bag of laundry. And she said, oh, I was on my way and I just dropped by. I said, okay. Hey, okay, cool. You want some coffee? And she went on to say, And I was on my way to do my laundry, but I forgot to bring some coins. And now I know fully what she means by that. What do you think she means by that? She's making an implicit request. Can I use your washer? Is what she's saying. Well, maybe that's how I'm actually reading it. I don't know. But it's a family. I've known her for over 40 years. So there's that thick pattern. So I thought, I almost said it because as a pattern, I usually say, oh, why don't you just use my, machine? It's okay. It's downstairs. Just use it. And she'll be like, oh, okay. Like acting all surprised. And she'd be like, oh, I guess I could. And I can give you money instead. That's the pattern. Like, it's almost like a greeting sequence pattern. And I'm like, no, don't worry about it, is what I am supposed to say. But yesterday was different because I was getting ready for this presentation. So I had to disrupt that pattern. So she is a victim of this presentation, by the way, because I did not go into saying, hey, why don't you do the laundry here? I didn't say that. Guess what I said? I said, I hope that you find some coins. She looked at me completely stunned. And she's like, oh, and I said, and that was it. I didn't say anything else. And she didn't know what to do. She's like, she's never heard me say it. I hope that you find enough coins. And she was like so confused. And in about 2 minutes, she's like, okay, I'm leaving. I said, okay, goodbye. Now, we still haven't talked about it. I'm going to talk to her about it actually, because I found it hilarious. You have these patterns at your homes, don't you? Somehow, maybe it's a sarcasm. It actually happens in very different ways, but people are expecting you to do something because you've been always doing it like that. And then they're like, they don't even have to say it. That's a shorthand. You know how it goes. But the moment that you stop and sort of like disturb that pattern, they're like, what? What do you mean? And that actually happens in a good way and also in bad ways too. People who are always on the receiving end of maybe sarcasm, bullying, and all those things, the minute they actually do something a little bit different, the other's behavior stops because you just disrupted their patterns, huh? And especially at workplaces too. Sometimes if you are the one who ends up doing everything that other people seem to not be doing, now that's a pattern. And when somebody's like, oh, I'm too busy, I'm sick, please don't be the first one saying, yeah, no problem, I'll just take it on. Another client of mine who is so loving and caring, and she is usually the one who does everything, especially when the other person was supposed to give her something by this deadline. And she is depending on that information for her presentation in the following week. And the other person did not deliver. And not only not deliver, the other person said, it's not going to be ready until like September. And she would usually say, no worries. No worries. I got it. No worries. She will do that all the time. But in our coaching conversation, that came up and she decided to use different pattern. And her pattern was going to be, instead of saying no worries, noted, no worries, instead of saying that, she was going to actually ask the other person, oh, okay, thank you for letting me know. And what's your plan B for this? Because it's your failure that I should not be like wiping after you. I mean, she didn't say the latter part, but the first part. And she said after she confronted the other person that way, their interaction completely changed because there's a thick pattern that was developing in their relationship that she then disturbed. Now, which is so interesting. Now, there you go, David. Thank you. Apologies. It's not a serious issue, by the way. Apologies. And here is something that we actually see as a pattern. What do your coachee or supervisee or mentee come and do? What do they do usually in conversation with you? There are some expected roles that they play, don't they? They talk, usually. They're the one who's talking about something. And now what do you do? Sitting there as a coach, supervisor, mentor, or sometimes even a friend, what do you do? What's expected when somebody's sharing things like that? You are supposed to listen, right? So somehow you're supposed to kind of listen and respond in a useful way, I hope. But then there are some patterns that we carry in our mind as a model of how to be useful. So for example, that old pattern that we hear over and over and over again from people saying, how can I help you? And we think that's a way to be helpful. So we ask, how can I help you? And in that question lies huge assumption that they need help. And I will help you. And somehow you will tell me how I can help. Or sometimes you even ask, or because you believe talking about your past will somehow save you your current struggles, or somehow it will actually help you build into the future. Many of us believe it, don't we? So then we ask them, what brought you here? And how do we know asking things like that actually leads to positive change in their life? And do we have research around it? And yes, we do. So here's what actually happens. As a pattern, let me actually write it down here so that you have it on record. So as a pattern, when coachee, when they come in, they tend to tell us, well, actually, you know what? I'm going to actually go to the next slide. I don't know if I included it or not. I hope I did. And the slide decided to not to move. So I guess I can just do it without. But when people come to us, there are some patterns that we actually have. So one pattern is when they come, they tell us something that actually happened to them in the past. That's one pattern. They also tell us something that might happen in the future, for example. So that's another pattern. So as a pattern, there's a timeline. So they tell us something that happened in the past, and there's something that they think might happen in the future. So here's a pattern number one about timeline. And probably some of you have friends and family who always come and talk about their past. Do you have them? Oh, my aunt, every time we see her, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, oh my gosh, she always goes back and it's like, drives my mom nuts. And she will always like almost the same story. And they do that. She just keeps on doing that. And it's like, oh my gosh, if you can just stop and move on. It happened 40 years ago. Some of you might be actually doing that in your argument with your loved ones. Remember last night? So that's the past talk. And oh man, I do that with my nephews. I actually, when they make a mistake, remember last, I say that to them. And then now some people will tell you something that might happen in the future, whether they're looking forward to it or not. They tell you. That's pattern number one of our client's narrative. And the second pattern that we see is pattern number two, is they tend to talk about something that they actually want to see happen more because they like it. And what we call it, maybe good stuff. They want to see it increase. Oh, that felt good. Oh, this is something that I want to see more. It could be interactions, feelings, experiences, whatever it was that you want to see it increase in your life. So let me do an arrow up. You want to increase it. And then also you have some things that you want to see decrease. I wish that will just, if that can stop, that'll be awesome. Okay. So this is very simple, like two patterns kind of like put together, especially from our client's narrative. And as a pattern, we have quadrant one, which is something that they would like to see in the future. And this quadrant has a name. The quadrant's name is preferred future, the future that you would prefer to have. And then what about the future that you would not prefer to have? That's dreaded future or fearful future, which is quadrant 4. So kind of like it's the future too, but it's the one that you're like, I really hope that doesn't happen. It's your dreaded future. And then that's kind of like going north, and this is kind of going south. And then now quadrant 2 is something that you really, really found useful, enjoyable, stuff that you have experienced from the past, whether directly or vicariously. And that is called resourceful past. And something, it doesn't even have to be a specific different person. It could be the same person. It's my sister. In the past, when I actually had better interactions with my sister, I actually, don't get me wrong, she is She works as a photographer and she has such artistic view on life. I love talking to her. But when it comes to like practical laundry stuff, but anyway, so resourceful past could be an example of my interaction with my sister that was really like, I thought it was so good. I would love to have one, like more of those. And the past that I would not like to increase in my life, past that I actually would like to take a pill to erase, it's for some of us, it's almost like traumatic past. For some of us, it's also regretful past. And, you know, there is that trauma, small t, big T trauma that humans actually carry. Just it's inherent nature of, I guess, being human. But one of the things that I find very interesting is sometimes even aging is, for some folks, it's experienced as trauma. But it's not because there's something wrong with them. It's because of how we contextualize. And we're going to get to that shortly. So quadrant 1 is called preferred future. Quadrant 2, resourceful past. Quadrant 3 is troubled past, I guess. And quadrant 4 could be dreaded future. Now, when you have a pattern like this, as a collective pattern of, let's say, we studied about 6,000 cases of people coming into therapy and coaching and their beginning narrative. We studied that and say, which quadrant are people more likely to be in? Take a guess. Which quadrant do you think people were more likely to begin with? What do you think? And many of you say 3, and some of you say 2. This is great. And actually, Nancy says 4. Cool. Many of you say 3, and some of you say 2, but you kind of know how it goes because naturally, when unprompted, we are more likely to, hey, that's so cool. Alfonso, you say 3 and 4. Okay. And unprompted, they will be more likely to start from below the line. So somehow they actually start from here. There could be some complex reason to it because one, when they come into some sort of therapy setting, their expectation might be, they think they're supposed to talk about that because they think they need to tell you everything that's wrong so that you can diagnose the problem, maybe. So maybe that's the reason. But somehow people come in and they're actually 3 times more likely to go from trouble past or dreaded future in their beginning of conversations. And, you know, in positive psychology, I think they notice it as negativity bias, that not only people are going to notice 3 times more of something that's negative or something that's more like a threat, but also they're more likely to talk about it. And when we hear them talk about it, our own negativity bias kicks in and we listen to those things 3 times more too. So as the client comes in to chat with us, and if you're untrained and you're not sure what to do with this conversation, your conversation might be actually 9 times more likely to be in quadrant 3 and 4. So that's what naturally happens. Now, you know, these days people say, oh, that's being negative, as if it's a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. This really served our humanity so well that we survived this like all this time because we are able to detect threats so we don't get killed. So it's very natural for us. It serves that evolutionary purpose. At the same time, in a coaching conversation, I work in a coaching space. So I give you examples from coaching field that people come in and they might actually have a very good reason to come, not because they want to keep talking about 3 and 4, but maybe they want to see something different. They want to see something change. So somehow their reason for coming is so that they can move this way. And this way is called resource activation, by the way, in the research literature. And the other way is called problem activation. So now that's a very simple, like little quadrant for you. And when you actually have this quadrant, then the way that we listen to our conversation may change a bit. So for example, if we actually go back to this guy talking about this, well, I need to figure out how I can support them get back on track. I've been struggling with it myself too, but I know that they look to me for support. I know this is not the first time, and it won't be the last time either. Now, if you see this very simple beginning, I need to figure out, now, where would you put that? In which quadrant would you actually put it? I need to figure out. What quadrant would you put in? Right? It's kind of like, it's pretty simple that you can see, oh, definitely. It's like, yeah, they want to figure out. So I need to figure out, okay, number one, quadrant number one, how I can support them. So supporting them, which quadrant would you put it? How I can support them. Okay, so maybe you can assume that they've been supporting them, but how I can support them could be also quadrant 2, how I can support them. And it's amazing that some of you say number 2, because support them get back on track. So supporting them to get back on track could be, the whole thing could be, I want to support them to get back on track, but also the fact that they say get back assumes that they were on track before. Isn't that interesting? And then now I've been struggling with it myself. Which quadrant would you put that in? And really easiest way is, do they want that? And did it happen in the past? So that's right, it's quadrant 3. See, this is so simple, isn't it? It's quadrant 3. I've been struggling with it. So it could be the fact that he's been struggling, or with it, both could be quadrant 3. But I know they look to me for support. I know that they look to me for support. Which quadrant would you put it? Oh, it's so interesting. Some of you say it's actually 4. Interesting. I know they look to me for support. Wow. So I think we can actually put it for 1 and 2, but for those of you who said 4, wow, it depends, because if you are kind of like really tired of people, like depending on you, you might feel like, oh my gosh, there's more people to support. Totally, it could be 4 as well. And the thing is, this is kind of like hard to judge because this is not my life. So you need to really listen to the client's context. What does it sound like? Well, kind of like, this guy wants to figure out how I can support them, and I know they look to me for support. It tends to go hand in hand. So we can't actually guess. It might be more likely to be in quadrant 1 or 2 than 3 and 4. It's just the best guess, right? And I know this is not the first time, and it won't be the last time either. And we don't know what this is. And we're not sure where to put it. Where would you put this? I know this is not the first time, and it won't be the last time either. What do you mean by this? It could be 4, 3. I know this is not the first time, and it won't be the last time. Any combination would do, 2 or 3 or 4 or even 1. Now, in this case, I don't think I actually introduced this idea, but this can be anywhere on the quadrant, right? So anywhere on the quadrant. So it's the X, QX, X factor. And, we'll talk another time about this X factor. But when you look at very simple narrative like this, and you can analyze it to quadrants 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then how will you respond? What kind of information from this narrative would you use to respond to this client? Some of you actually picked up on words that actually belong to quadrant 2. Some of you asked about support. How? So what are some ideas about supporting? What does that look like? And what does it mean to, like, let's say, get back on track? And some of you actually also pick up on this word struggle. I've been struggling with it. You want to ask more about Q3. And when you actually make a choice, this is going to determine your next response from the client, as you have seen before, because our job is to listen, select, so that the conversation can build on it. So this is how you can use the quadrant. And what's interesting is then, what do people who are seasoned practitioners in coaching, mentoring, and supervision, what do they do? What do you think that they actually do as a very clear pattern in their practice? So when your clients give you this kind of narrative, practitioners, they tend to do this, who are kind of new to the whole coaching thing. When you actually read, oh, there's a thunder. when you actually see their narrative, practitioners tend to shoot questions after questions. So you wait till they're done talking and you shoot questions. So, and then you throw a question at them, which is okay, which is like totally okay. But that's what we see as a pattern in novice practitioners. Then what do seasoned practitioners do when we hear narratives like this? They don't shoot questions. They start with a statement, what we call formulations. So before you ask a question, you simply take some time to acknowledge. Sometimes people say, oh, do we summarize, paraphrase? Not necessarily. It may sound like this. If you are formulating based on this one, you might say, okay, so you want to figure out some ways to support them. Now that's a statement. And you know how it functions when you make a statement like that? Client will not only say yes, but they're more likely to actually then expand on it. They're like, yeah, I do, because, and they might actually go into the reasons why they want to figure out how, they can support. So seasoned practitioners as a pattern seem to use more statements. Sometimes many of those statements actually function as if we just asked the question. Okay, so that's a very interesting pattern to notice, especially differentiating from novice to seasoned practitioner. Second one that we see is not only they use less of their own words, but they preserve way more of our client's language. So you wouldn't necessarily introduce new words, but you have enough to cook with here. So you might, preserve, figure out, support, and some of those words rather than, and the way that they actually preserve the language, more likely from quadrant 1 and 2. It's a very interesting pattern we see. So they're more likely to preserve the client language, but not any language, because you can actually preserve language like, so you've been struggling with it, tell me more. Which quadrant do you think they're going to tell you if you do that? So you've been struggling. How long you've been struggling with it for, yourself? Tell me more. Which quadrant do you think they're going to give you? And very likely this may not be an interesting or useful direction. However, you would like to acknowledge it. We don't explore it, but we do acknowledge quadrant 3 and 4. So for example, it may sound like this. So while you've been struggling with it yourself, client nods, you will also like to support other people, nod. So what gives you confidence that you can support yourself and others through this? Which quadrant do you think the client will talk about? Oh my gosh, isn't that fascinating? Okay. So the client, when you actually say, so you've been struggling with this yourself, and in the meantime, you want to also support other people. So what gives you confidence that this might actually, that you can support yourself and others through this? Very likely they will tell you in quadrant 1 and 2. And that's our influence on their next narrative. So when our clients come in and be all negative, we're like, oh my gosh, I had a negative client. Well, look at what you did. Very likely you somehow contributed to the content this way, because it goes by like almost every line, it goes hand in hand. So those are some patterns that we see. And also what we actually do is, especially in our questions, not only in how we formulate formulations and statements, but formulations and statements actually usually they work as acknowledging what they said, so that the client does not need to repeat. So for example, if you have a client who keeps talking, you know why they do that? They talk a lot. And it's not because they are, that kind of client. It's because you are not giving them the cue that you're listening. So if you want to really support a client who is very talkative, simple interrupting, subtle interruptions like, okay, wow, so if you want to figure this out, okay, back channeling, we call it, then they don't have to repeat, because now they know that they are listened to. So if you have a client who's talking a lot, it's not their problem, but it's interactionally, you might be encouraging it because you didn't give them the cue that you're listening. So these are some individual and interactional patterns that we see. And especially when we are using questions as interventions, a lot of coaching companies and accreditations, accreditation bodies and so on, we oversell questions in coaching as if it's like the thing that, makes a difference. Actually, questions are not even necessary sometimes when you coach. Really, I mean, I would love to hear from your experience when you next time in your coaching session, see if you can actually coach somebody without even using questions. And that's really possible. They will stretch your practice for sure. But when you actually see seasoned practitioners, they use questions very little, way less than they used to as they get better. Isn't that fascinating? So if you have a book or cue cards with questions, well, and really the only question you need to remember in coaching is, what did I hear the clients say that they want? And simply build on it. Because usually the chances are, if they say they want something, then it's in quadrant 1. And even if they say, what about the clients then who don't want to be there, who are mandated? Like it's not their idea to come in. Or what if the clients actually, they say, especially the teenage years, I don't know if you have anyone living at your house, but any question I ask, if they verbalize it, it's nothing. Or if they gesture, it's like, Huh? You know what I mean? So how do you work with clients who may say, I don't know? So when you hear people, and even when actually, let's say then a client comes in and their narrative is full of quadrant 3 and 4. And the typical complaint, like complainer, complaining nonstop. How do you work with people? They're not telling you what I want, but they're telling you what they don't want. So actually, some people mentioned here, what is it that you want instead? That's going to shift the conversation almost immediately. When somebody comes and complains to you about something, all they're telling you is something that they care about is violated. So they want something different. So then we're simply asking them, so what is it that you want a little bit different? Or instead of what you're just talking about, it's completely, it's going to really change the direction. And I see that some of your comments here about questions and questioning as an intervention. Now, what we do in our questions, seasoned practitioners are more likely to sort of embed assumptions in a more specific way. And I tell you this because, let's say, if you start your session by saying, how are you? Okay. If you say, how are you? Which quadrant do you think you're inviting them to actually tell you? How are you? What do you think that people will tell you? It can be anywhere. It can be like 2, sometimes 3. So when you say what's on your mind, okay? Now, when you are not really specifying which quadrant that you're asking them to talk about, 3 times more likely you're going to get 3 or 4. So what's on your mind? Oh, well, I've been thinking quadrant 3, quadrant 4, 3 times more likely. Now, how would you actually word it if you really want your clients to actually orient their attention to quadrant 2? What would you actually ask in your question? If that's your assumption, then number 1, looking at your resourceful past will be useful. And I think you have some. So I would love to know more about your resourceful past. How would you word it in a question form? Right in the beginning of your coaching session, if your assumption is to go to quadrant 2, how would you say it? Try out in the chat box or even like write down. What would you say? Wow, how have you managed this before? What are some recent successes and highlights? Hey, what positive happened to you today? What has worked well for you so far? Okay. And this is so interesting. Now, we want to really get our clients to sort of like look at this. But let's say the client actually has a specific topic. And, I had a very traumatic case that I just heard, and I didn't even have a heart to ask them. So what are you like? I don't know, like what's the one highlight of this week? I just didn't have heart to ask, because knowing the context of that trauma, ooh, I don't know. And some of you are already like, noticing that we can really, like, we can restrict the scope of responses that our client gives us. And you know what, microanalysis, and especially in therapeutic literature, what they actually say is useful is right from the get-go, getting our clients to look at the preferred future. If that is evidence-based practice, that we really want our clients to focus on preferred future, especially in the beginning, what would you say? Huh. Right in the beginning, what would you say? Yes, thank you, Ivan or Ivan. How do you say your name?
It's Ivan.
Ivan. Okay, so Ivan, journalists, I usually, one of the first things I do is read like a news in the morning, which is apparently people tell me not to do, but I will feel bad if I don't know what's going on. So I read it anyway. Now, when I read it, oftentimes it doesn't say anything nice about what's happening in the world. And I think they're now, kind of like catching on a little bit. So usually this news that I read, they have a little bit at the end. Oh, finally, good news for today. They have a little paragraph, which is kind of almost pathetic. But journalists, absolutely. What makes news is quadrant 3 and quadrant 4, especially going through this whole entire pandemic. What did you hear? Q3 full, Q4, like to its full glory. We heard Q3 and 4. Like we are more informed than like some doctors, we think. It's amazing. Now, some of you say, what is your greatest hope for our conversation? What would be an ideal outcome for you? What do you want to work towards? And all those things. And yes, Nicola, bad news sells, right? Now, usually people say we kind of like have to get our clients to pay attention to quadrant 1. But here's some quadrant 1 questions that may not work, because this will be almost like positive fantasizing. So in 10 years' time, where do you see yourself? Stop asking that in an interview. Like 10 years' time, I'm just trying to, I don't know. So when you ask them about 10 years later, okay, or even like, next year this time, it's way far to remove that. It's how is it relevant to your meeting together. So whenever you're asking about quadrant 1, usually novice practitioners do this like big leap. So let's say everything went the way, like perfectly fine. Even the miracle question. So suppose tomorrow you wake up and miracle happened, what will be different? Well, I will be a millionaire. Now, what are you going to do with that information? Because the slight mistake that we made in like asking that question is we did not make their goal relevant to us meeting here, which is the time and place we have right now, quadrant 0. And simply quadrant 1 sounds kind of like this. How would you know that somehow us meeting together was useful for you as you are getting back to your like normal life, maybe even after this, maybe even tomorrow, maybe later this week? What will tell you that this meeting was actually useful for you? Now you make their outcome relevant to our meeting together. And they're not going to be like, can you help me win the lottery? They will not say that. And quadrant 1, based on their hopes and dreams, and also relevant to the reason of our meeting, that is going to do the magic. And this is one of the more consistent patterns that we find over and over again in conversations that we study of seasoned professionals. So, I mean, there are so many more that we can play with here, but I get so excited about these things because this really has a potential to change like everything that you do. Like think about it, conversation actually being the place where we live. You can impact your headspace, your actually home space, your workspace. You can really impact spaces that you actually occupy with another person simply using this different way of listening and responding. Isn't that so cool if you think about it? Changing the world is not that difficult, you think? I don't know. That's what excites me, and that's what keeps me going. I don't know about you, but there you go. There's a more official sort of like graphic of the dialogic orientation quadrant. But if you want to know more about it, let me know. It will be so fun to hear from you about what you do with what you learned here.